Welcome to the third chapter of the Bankers Masterclass series on corporate banking's great transformation in association with Mashreq Bank. I'm John Everington, Middle East and Africa editor at The Banker, and I'm joined again by Joel van Dusen, Mashreq Bank's Group Head of Corporate and Investment Banking. In this third of four chapters, we'll be talking about the growing importance of ESG in the Middle East region in particular, and how standards are evolving. Joel, thanks again for joining us today.
Thank you, John. It's an interesting topic.
So ESG has become an increasingly relevant concern for Middle East corporates and governments over the past 5 years. What explains this development and how are corporate banks responding to this?
Yeah, it's so first of all, let me say COP27 and 28, it's wonderful to have those in the region. It's going to make a substantial impact, I think, to how this region focuses on sustainability goals. And it's certainly an honor for the UAE to have COP28. So we're looking forward to that. For the first time, the COP events will be focused on finance as a theme. Many topics, water, energy transition, will get center stage. This year, we're going to also talk. This year and next year, there'll be quite a bit of focus on how do we finance the energy transition? How do we finance net zero? And that I think will shed a light on some of the issues, because obviously it's estimated that there's going to be about $1 to $2 trillion a year needed to get to net zero by 2050. And no one entity can help finance that in one fell swoop. So this is going to take an ecosystem. Banks will play an important role, but so will asset managers, the public sector, insurance companies, et cetera. And I think for the first time, COP27 and 28 will address finance as an issue and ideas to solve the financing requirements that will be needed with everything else that will be discussed in the meetings. So green finance, you referenced finance. Green finance represents a significant and untapped area for the MENA region as a whole. The region lags a bit behind its global counterparts. Probably because of the historic reliance on hydrocarbons, but countries like the UAE and Saudi Arabia are now striving to establish themselves as sustainability leaders. And we've seen quite a bit of action. I mean, if you saw that the UAE, the first country in MENA to announce this, will go net zero in emissions by 2050. I would expect that we would see other announcements as we progress toward COP27 and 28 in the next year and a half. So, investors around the world are pouring money into ESG assets. It's estimated, I think, by Bloomberg that the asset base by 2030 will be 50 trillion. That represents probably 20% of the global asset base. So there is a real focus on investments, and obviously the finance will have to be a big part of that. So what does that mean for GCC? There's been a recent global consulting firm that did some analysis that said the green investments that will be financed in just 6 industries in the GCC could have a profound impact on the region's economy. And there's going to be, they estimate, about $2 trillion of cumulative GDP growth between now and 2030, just across 6 sectors, unlocking 1 million jobs and additional FDI into the region. So there's a lot of positive trends that this financing discussion will have, and the green financing wave that we expect to see will result in. I mentioned that it's going to take an ecosystem, a financing ecosystem, but banks will clearly play a central and important role in what will be needed. There's been a fair amount of green finance that has been mobilized over the last couple of years through the use of sustainability-linked loans and bonds. If you look at the data, we've seen financing in MENA grow to about 18.6 billion in 2021 versus 4.5 billion in 2020. So there's been a substantial uptick in sustainability-linked focus and the loans and the bonds that go along with those SDGs. MENA has outpaced the growth in green financing in 2021. Obviously, they're still a small fraction of the global financing pool. I think we represent here in MENA probably 2% of the international volumes, but there is there is an acceleration in focus on the finance that's going to be needed to fund the green transition, and certainly the banks will play a large role and are focused on providing those securities and those offerings. The banks themselves have, including Mashreq, are raising ESG financing. If you look across GIB, Riyadh Bank, National Bank of Kuwait, there's been a number of firsts in ESG financings for the banks themselves. So the ecosystem here in MENA is gearing up to help finance the transition and to help ESG in general.
When it comes to ESG, what are the easiest wins for UAE and GCC corporates, and what are the biggest challenges, would you say?
Well, so the first thing we're doing, for example, is we're having an active dialogue with our clients on their ESG goals. If you look in the last year alone, there's been 225 large companies in the UAE, just the UAE, that have announced ESG goals for themselves. So there's a growing focus. And so one of the areas that is going to be needed is finance, and to help sustain these goals. Sustainability linked loans are the first financing security of choice here in the MENA region. We've seen $13.1 billion of financings that Mashreq Bank has been involved with just in the last 12 months. There's clearly going to be green loans and green bonds, but the sustainability linked loan really is driven toward an individual corporate's SDGs and linking the pricing of the loan to their performance and their progress in those goals. So I think that awareness and that dialogue that many of our corporate clients are having is going to be key as we approach the next year or two.
As ESG becomes more mainstream, there's increasing cynicism over greenwashing and how various metrics can be gamed. How can ESG standards evolve to become smarter and more meaningful going forward?
There's been a lot of dialogue recently on standards. So if you look at TCFD, which is being adopted by many countries as a start, I think we will start to see convergence, if you will, around reporting standards. One of the first things we've seen here in the UAE and in MENA in general is just a growing awareness of, from the corporate level, of what their corporate goals should be, how can they contribute, what their SDGs should be, and then financing that progress and linking some of the financings to those goals. I think the next wave will, after we get through the initial period of awareness on financing alternatives and more of a dialogue, in the public forum about what the corporate goals are to begin with, I think we'll see some convergence in the region as to some of the global standards that are now emerging. And I think COP27 and 28 will help drive that dialogue, because one of the big topics, you're right, that's being debated recently is should we have one global standard from a reporting perspective? Because there is a lot of room for greenwashing, as you say.
It's certainly an evolving area, and it's going to be interesting to see what progress is made at the COP meetings, as you mentioned. Thank you again for sharing your thoughts, Joel.
Thank you, John.
In the final chapter of this series, we'll be talking about the importance of building an ecosystem of smart partnerships in the corporate space. Do join us then.